Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation with a Survivor speaker series. Whether you've joined us here for previous sessions last year, or if it's your first time tuning in, we're thrilled to have you all be part of this important programming. My name is Daniela Lurian. I'm Tour for Humanity Director and Educator here at the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. As we're getting started, I'll remind everyone to please keep their videos off and their mics muted. This presentation, as you all just heard, is being recorded and will be available later on this week. We do welcome questions, so please feel free to send them at your leisure using the chat function here on Zoom throughout. Depending on time, we'll do our best to address as many of them as possible. Today, I'm joined by Hannah Marazzi from the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights, Michael Levitt, FSWC President and CEO, and of course, our wonderful guest speaker for today, Israel Unger. As we begin, I want to turn the stage over to our President and CEO, Michael Levitt.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And it's really wonderful to be kicking off this season's In Conversation with Israel today. This program, I know many of you, because I scrolled through and I saw the names, I recognized many of them from multiple visits to our program, which I think was on Wednesdays last year as well, or last season as well. It's great to have so many of you coming back. And I think I can say with confidence that so many of those sessions were amazingly impactful as we got to really hear with raw emotion what people had been through, and really their testimony was an inspiration. And Israel, I have no doubt that that's going to be the case today again with you as well. I also want to just let everybody know that for this session of sessions as well, we're really proud to partner with the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, my friend, my mentor, Erwin Kotler, and the whole team at Raoul Wallenberg. And Erwin would be with us here today, but he's had an incredibly busy day participating in the Malmo forum on Holocaust remembrance and anti-Semitism. And of course, in Erwin's role as the special envoy, that was, he had a major part to play in that, and Canada's pledges on the front lines of combating anti-Semitism and ensuring that we all, everybody has the opportunity to learn about the Holocaust. But while we don't have Erwin, we do, as Daniela said, have Hannah Marazzi. And Hannah is serving as Erwin's special advisor in his role as special envoy for preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Hannah has previously served with the United Nations, the national think tank Cardus, and serves as the co-editor of Opt-in, a beginner's handbook to Canadian politics. Hannah also serves as a board member for the Matthew House Ottawa, a refugee shelter and community furniture bank located in the nation's capital. So without further delay, representing both Erwin and the Wallenberg Centre, Hannah, I turn the floor to you.
Oh, thank you for such a warm welcome and a warm introduction. And might I just reaffirm that Professor Kotler so wishes that he could be here with you today. As we heard over and over again today at the Malmo Forum, and as we believe deeply, story and testimony is central to our way forward, both as a nation and as a community. And story is something that will guide us, the shining light, as we move forward together as a country and as individuals, learning to better belong to one another, care for one another. And so today I am so privileged just to say welcome to our speaker, and to say the gift of this next hour is entirely ours. Your story is a gift to us. Your presence is a gift to us. And we look forward to hearing from you and to bearing witness to the gift of your testimony, and from leaving this hour galvanized to continue to bring that story out into the communities to which we all belong, to better propel us to fight against anti-Semitism, racism, all forms of xenophobia, and to better belong to our neighbor. But we cannot do that work without individuals like you who serve as not only pillars of our community, but shining guides. And I know my own life has been irrevocably shaped by the testimony of individuals just like you. So both on behalf of Professor Erwin Kotler, on behalf of the center, but also very selfishly on a personal note, thank you for the gift of what you're about to share. I can't wait to hear.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Hannah, and for the ongoing partnership. Without further ado, I'm going to present all of you to our guest speaker for today, Israel Unger. Izzy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I couldn't resist, given the introduction that I just had, that you obviously know that I had a connection with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, but I also have a connection with Erwin Kotler. Many years ago, I and various others gathered in Ottawa, and Erwin at that time was a professor of law at McGill University, and we started an organization, Canadian Professors for Peace in the Middle East. I haven't seen Erwin since, but he's gone on to wonderful things. In November 1999, there was a bill introduced in the New Brunswick legislature to commemorate the Holocaust each and every year on the date that it occurs on the Hebrew calendar. New Brunswick was not the first province to have such a bill. Ontario was, and I believe it was PEI was second and New Brunswick was third. In due course, all 10 provinces had similar bills, and as did the federal government. And in each and every case, those bills were passed unanimously. When the bill was first introduced in the New Brunswick legislature, my wife and I were not in New Brunswick. We were actually in Los Angeles. But we followed the passage of the bill with keen interest. And one morning at breakfast, my wife said to me, you know, people in New Brunswick are probably asking themselves, why do we need a bill to commemorate the Holocaust in New Brunswick? It didn't happen in New Brunswick. And many New Brunswickers went and fought the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and many of them didn't return. So why do we need a bill to commemorate the Holocaust in New Brunswick? And that's the question that I want to address. And the best way that I can do it is to tell you a little bit about my early history. I was born in March 1938 in a small town in southwestern Poland called Tarnow. In 1938, Tarnow had a population of 56,000. Of that, 26,000 were Jewish. It was probably the most evenly balanced city as between Jews and non-Jews in Poland. So what do I remember? I was approximately 1.5 years old when the German war machine smashed into Poland. I would have been approximately 5 years old, 1943, when the Nazi onslaught against the Jews reached its full fury. And I was 7 years old when we were liberated by the Soviet Red Army. Mostly what I remember is fear. We knew that the Nazis intended to murder every single Jew they could lay their hands on. It was just an issue of when, where, and how. And at that time in Poland, the murder of the Jews proceeded in the following way. They would gather Jews from small villages and outlying areas to larger centers, put them in the ghetto, and then when presumably the local Gestapo would be notified the transport was available, they take them down to the train station and ship them off to the extermination camps, the death camps. Those occasions were called wysiedlenia in Polish, which just simply translates to sending away. So I recall, and incidentally, my memory is the memory of a child. It's not the memory of an adult. I can't tell you whether an event preceded or followed another event. And I certainly can't tell you that my memory is complete, because it is not. So on one such wysiedlenia, I recall being held in my father's arms, and I asked him repeatedly to say the last prayer with me so that we would go to heaven. What notions a 5-year-old has of heaven and hell, I don't know. But that day, I expected to be killed. And if that was the case, I wanted to go to heaven. My father apparently kept count. And after the war, he told me that on that day, we recited that prayer 36 times. I recall being in my father and my grandfather's apartment. Why I was there, how I got to be there, I have no idea. My grandfather was an observant, pious, Orthodox Jew. Apartment is a little bit of a misnomer. It was a one room. And while I was there, 2 Nazis came in and they ordered my grandfather to go with them. My grandfather instantly stood up and he tucked under his arm his prayer bag, which would have contained his phylacteries and his prayer book and his prayer shawl. And when he lived in an upstairs apartment, and when he got to the head of the stairs, one of them pushed him or kicked him, and he fell down the stairs. And as he fell down the stairs, they shot him. I recall discussing this with my mother years after the war, and she told me that my recollection was indeed correct. I recall the night that we escaped from the ghetto. My father took my brother and I, my brother was 4 years older than I, to the ghetto wall. And it was wintertime, there was snow outside, it was cold. Poland has much the same climate as Canada. When we got to the ghetto wall, my brother scrambled to the top of the ghetto wall, but I was too small to be able to get up to the top by myself. So my father put me up, and my brother pulled me up, and we got to the top of the ghetto wall. And when we did, my brother pulled me over and we fell into the snow. And I recall shots being fired as we were doing this. And presumably other Jews were trying to escape from the ghetto, and the ghetto was patrolled. And if anyone was seen, they were immediately shot. For the last 2 years of the war, we were hidden. There was a group of 9 of us, my brother and I, my mother and father, a young couple, 2 sisters, and an elderly lady. We were hidden behind a wall in the attic of a flour mill. And I recall that we had endless discussions. How we knew, we somehow, or the adults somehow knew what was going on. They knew where the Soviet armies were. They knew when D-Day occurred. I can't tell you that they knew about it in June 6, 1944, or was it July, or not, but they knew that it had happened. And they knew that the Soviet armies were advancing towards Germany and towards Poland. We wondered whether we would survive, whether we would make it, and would we be liberated by the Western Allies or by the Soviets? At that point, the Soviets conducted their operations in the following way. They would launch an offensive and they would go so far, and then they would run out of steam and they would stop, resupply, re-equip, and then launch another offensive. Towards the end, their penultimate offensive reached close to Tarnow, and we knew that they were within striking distance of Tarnow, but they had stopped. And we wondered whether we would survive, whether we would make it. And then one morning, very early in the morning, there was shell fire, and shortly thereafter, Soviet soldiers appeared in the streets of Tarnow. And they had white camouflage. And I cannot describe to you how overjoyed we were to see the Soviet soldiers. Several of them came to the flour mill, and we rushed out to greet them. When I got to the head of the stairs of the flour mill, I started down the steps, but I hadn't walked on stairs for 2 years. And either because I was so weak or because I hadn't walked on stairs, I stumbled and I fell down the stairs. When I got to the bottom of the staircase, I found myself next to a Soviet soldier. I put my arms around his boots and I kissed his boots. It strikes me that when events get too large, they lose all meaning. If I tell somebody that a cup of coffee at Tim Hortons is $2, you know exactly what I mean. If I say that a car costs $20,000, you know exactly what I mean. But if you say that the budget of Canada is $1 trillion, it just loses all meaning. If I say that the distance from Fredericton to Toronto is 1,400 kilometers, it has some meaning. But if we talk about the distance from Fredericton to the sun as being 153 million kilometers, what does that mean? In terms of humans, let me tell you about 2 stories that I think bring into perspective what the Nazis did to the Jews. They murdered 6 million Jews, but that's a big number. But what does it really mean? Well, it was half of the Jewish population at the time in the world. It was 90% of the 3.5 million Jews living in Poland. But once again, these are numbers. What do they really mean? Well, just before the end of the war, there was a camp in the Nazis were carrying out experiments on so-called medical experiments on Jewish children. There were 26 Jewish children, and it was in Hamburg, Germany. They saw the end coming, so they killed all the Jewish children. They took them down in the cellar and they hung them. The perpetrators were caught and they were judged in Nuremberg. And one of them said that the Jewish children didn't even cry. And some of them were so weak that they had to pull on their legs in order to murder them. I'm going to read to you the names of 2 of those 26 Jewish children. One was Leah Kligman, who was 8 years old at the time. Another one was Manya Altman, who was 5 years old at the time. I've tried this several times, It takes me 15 seconds to read those two girls' names. If I was to read the names of the Jewish children, 1.5 million Jewish children murdered by the Nazis, it would take me 290 days, 9 months and 20 days to read the names of the Jewish children murdered by the Nazis. The other story that I want to relate to you, that for me at least, it brings into perspectives what the Nazis did to the Jews. And this concerns a story by Simon Wiesenthal, a famous Nazi hunter. Simon Wiesenthal was in a camp and was in Austria, and he was working in the camp when the Nazi guards came up and said, "Come with me." Wiesenthal thought he was going to be murdered. It was arbitrary. There never were any reasons, but he wasn't. And they took him outside the camp and they took him to a hospital. And then they took him to a room where a young SS-man was lying grievously wounded and about to die. And this SS-man had asked to see the Jew. And this Jew happened to be Simon Wiesenthal. They sat Simon Wiesenthal down by the bed of this young SS-man, and the guard left and the nurse left. And this young SS-man now told his story to Simon Wiesenthal, how proud they were in their uniforms, how they hoped that they would see some action, but they were afraid they wouldn't. But they did. And one day they found themselves in a small village in the Ukraine, and they gathered up all the Jews. He said perhaps 150 or 175, and they crammed them into one house. And he told Wiesenthal about the fear of the Jews as they were being herded into this house, and how some of the men were forced to carry jerry cans of gasoline into the house. And when they had completed, they locked the doors, surrounded the house, threw grenades into the house. There was fire, there was explosions, and from an upper story window, a man and a woman and a child jumped out. And the man was shielding the face of the child against his chest. And when they hit the ground, they shot them. And now this SS-man asked Simon Wiesenthal to forgive him. Well, when I read that story, I thought to myself, just consider the horror, the anguish of that woman and that child and that man, and consider that in one way or another, that happened 6 million times. I'd like to show you some pictures now, if I can, and I'll use the share screen to show you what it meant to me, what the Holocaust meant to me personally. So the pictures I'm going to show you were sent to me by Adam Bartosz, the director of the Tarnow Museum. This was the building. This was actually a machine shop that was associated with the flour mill, and the arrow points to that part of the attic where we were hidden. And now this is the area that we were hidden. It's approximately 6 feet by 20 feet. And you see here the false wall. There's the actual wall and the false wall. And in the bottom corner is the entryway that we had from the main part of the attic into our hiding place. And this is the back of the hiding place. You could stand up in this area, but obviously you couldn't in the other. And this is Mr. Adam Bartosz. He is the director of the Tarnow Museum. He was alerted that when they were destroying the flour mill, that they found a hiding place where Jews were hidden, and he came and with a crew and they photographed it. And he's illustrating the entry into our hiding place. This is a picture that was taken after the war in the Jewish cemetery in Tarnow. It was a monument that was built by the surviving Jews, most of which had escaped. Of the 26,000 Jews that had been living in Tarnow, there were something like 700 that survived. Most of them had made it to the Soviet Union. Some survived the camps. The monument was built by those 700 Jews over a mass grave, which is assumed to hold something like 10,000 bodies. And the inscription is from a poem by Chaim Nachman Bialik, and it says, "The sun was shining and was not ashamed." There were 8,000 Jewish children in Tarnow prior to the war. These are the ones that survived. That boy was my brother, and that little boy was me. This is a picture of the monument as it is today. This is a picture of the new synagogue in Tarnow. It took 63 years to build that synagogue. The Nazis burned it down in 2 days. This is a picture of the bima, the central area where prayers were recited in the new synagogue. And this is a picture of that same bima, all that was left over. After the war, we lived in an apartment that was that overlooked where the synagogue had been. And you can see, I hope, the wild weeds that were growing out of the bima. And somehow I felt that that was appropriate. So this is a picture of Żydowska ulica, Jew Street. And this is the building that we were living in. And this is the bima now, with the cupola was built over it to keep it from deteriorating any further. That was done by the Tarnow Museum. And this is a picture of Żydowska ulica. And you'll notice, I hope, that the cobblestones, there's one little area that is different from the rest of the cobblestones. These cobblestones, the main part, were put in after the war. I don't know precisely when, but the Tarnow Museum preserved these cobblestones because when the first mass murder took place in Tarnow, it was recorded, it was in the town square, and it was recorded that blood ran down the streets, and they had to call in the fire department to wash the streets down. So this is a picture of, this is a map of Tarnow as it is today. It was much smaller in 1938, but the black mark is the outline of the ghetto. And this is the main street down which the Soviet army came. And you can see that into this little area, they crammed in 26, well, ultimately it was 40,000 because there were many Jews that were brought in from surrounding villages. And this is the same picture, but this picture was done, or the drawing was done by the Tarnow Gestapo. And you'll notice that the ghetto is subdivided into 3 sections. When they killed off so many Jews, they made it smaller. When they killed off some more, they made it smaller yet again. And so this area was the final ghetto before they liquidated it. These pictures that I'm showing you now are mine. All the previous ones came from the Tarnow Museum. This is a picture of my mother, her brother David, and one of her sisters. David actually survived the war. He was in some concentration camp in Germany. They were liberated by the American army. Another Jew from the same camp came and told my parents that David had survived. But the Americans were kind and generous, and they let him have too much food, and his system couldn't take it. And a week or so later, he died. And this is a picture of one of my aunts and her little boy. I assume that he's less than a year old because he obviously can't stand by himself. They were murdered by the Nazis, but we don't know where and when. And this is a picture of my maternal grandparents. This is the only, I have no pictures, nothing of my paternal uncles and aunts. And this is the only picture I have of my maternal grandparents. And this is the grandfather that I saw shot. So that's all for the pictures. I'll stop share now. So it brings me full circle, and it brings me to Washington. Some of you will have visited Washington, and if you have, you know that besides being the political center of the United States, it's also a cultural center, and it has many, many museums. The best known museum is the Smithsonian, which has 56 museums all by itself within Washington. And each and every one of those museums is dedicated to the achievements of humanity in art and science and literature and technology, music. And in 1993, the United States opened the Holocaust Memorial Museum. It took 6 years to build that museum. And people asked themselves, why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? It didn't happen in Washington. The Americans fought the Nazis, the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and 440,000 of them didn't come home. So why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? Michael Berenbaum was the first senior curator of the Washington Holocaust Museum. And he knew that that question was being asked. And he wrote a book about the holdings of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And on the last page, in the last paragraph of his book, he answered that question, and I'll read you his answer. The Holocaust Memorial Museum reminds each of us how vigilant we must remain in defending the core human values of individual dignity, social justice, and human rights. Elie Wiesel said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. Thank you for listening. So now I'd be happy to try and answer questions.
First of all, I want to say Israel, is it, do you prefer Israel or do you prefer Izzy?
Either one.
I want to thank you so much on behalf of everyone else listening for sharing that and for all the different sort of components that you put into it. I think it was not only listening to your harrowing experiences, especially as a child, but I love ending with Elie Wiesel and Michael Berenbaum, and exactly why we're all here is for that, to answer those questions, is to carry on and to make sure that the voices and that the information and the knowledge about the past is carried through. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit. I know you mentioned when you and your family and the other families were hidden behind the wall in the attic. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what it was like when you got to, I won't call it liberation yet per se, but when you got to leave the attic. Do you remember what that experience was and what was that like? After being hidden in that space, to be able to leave it for the first time?
Well, first of all, it was unbelievable joy and relief, but then it got scared again, because there's a river that runs by Tarnow, and the German army retreated across the river, and the Soviet army came into Tarnow, and then they started shelling. The Germans started shelling Tarnow, and we feared that they were coming back. And it so happened that my father saw a Russian officer, a major, who happened to be a Jewish Russian. And he begged him, if you are going to retreat, please take us with you. And the Russian major said, don't worry, we're not leaving. And as the night wore on, and I remember I was lying on my back, and you could see the German shells going over onto the Russian side, and then the Russians started to respond. And you could see the shells going the other way. And as the night wore on, the shelling from the Germans decreased and stopped, but the Russian thing still carried on. And the next day, and the next days, we saw hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers moving through Tarnow on their way to Berlin.
I can't, none of us can imagine those kinds of experiences. I'm wondering if you can tell us, I saw a question come in about your experiences immediately at liberation, after the war, and then coming to Canada. If you can talk a little bit about how that process happened for you and your family.
Well, what happened was that, first of all, anti-Semitism still raged on in Poland. And indeed, Tarnow is very close to a city whose name I forget right now, where a pogrom was carried out after the war against the survivors in that town. And indeed, there was something like 1,000 Jews that were murdered by their Polish neighbors after the war, mostly because these Jews wanted to reclaim their possessions, which had been taken over by non-Jews. And so the easiest way to do that was to kill the Jews. Now, we were not, out of the 350,000 Jews that survived, in Poland, 300,000 left. You weren't allowed to leave. My father found out that there was a group called Rescue Children, which was actually organized by an American congressman from New York and Eleanor Roosevelt, who were taking Jewish orphans out of Poland and had been given permission to do so. And my father went to Krakow, which is the second largest city in Poland and only 100 kilometers from Tarnow, and got the leaders of that group to agree to take my brother and I. And so we left. And I didn't know whether we'd ever see my parents again. But we left legitimately, and my parents smuggled their way out of Poland. I ended up with my brother in this orphanage in France. And somehow or another, my father found us. And one day he appeared in this orphanage and he left again. But then he came back and he took my brother and I out. And then we lived in France for a little while. But then the Korean War started. And my parents figured that the Korean War was prelude to another world war in the same way that the Spanish Civil War had been a prelude to the Second World War, and they wanted to get out. And besides, Europe was just a mass grave for us. And they wanted to leave. And they found out that my mother had a cousin living in Montreal, and they somehow contacted him and he agreed to sponsor us. And so in January 1951, we made it to Montreal.
Wow. I noticed that, well, I know that you've published your book, The Unwritten Diary of Israel Unger, and that the woman in our flyer that we've been using was I believe your co-author. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What inspired you to begin writing down your memoirs? And more than that, what was the process like for you? How was it very difficult to think back on those memories, to bring them up again? Was it sort of, for some people it's freeing, for some people it's very difficult, for some people it's a lot of both? If you can kind of speak about that process.
For me, it wasn't difficult. And what inspired me to do it was Carolyn Gammon, who today lives in Berlin, but was born and raised in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And she had written a book about a lady named Helena Krauser. And she was living in Berlin at the time. And she came to Fredericton because her mother lived in Fredericton and she has a brother living in Fredericton. And she came to see me. And we talked, and she suggested that we write the book. And I said, well, there isn't a book there. I was very young and my memories are not complete by any means. And she said, yes, but what happened after is also interesting. So I said, well, I guess I was one of 300,000 Jews that left Poland, or one of 350 that survived. And I was one of 40,000 that came to Canada, and one of 17,000 that made it to Montreal. So if you think that you want to use me as a something that happened to many people, then we can do this. So I wrote down my memories, and Carolyn, who is a wonderful person, but much too thorough, insisted that we check every fact and look at archives, etc. And one of the things that we found is that the orphanage, the documents about the orphanage, are in Yeshiva University in New York. So Carolyn insisted that we go to New York. And we did. And we found out that I was adopted by a family in New Jersey while I was in the orphanage. And there's a letter that was written to them, to the orphanage, saying, what happened to Israel Unger? We sent him a parcel and we haven't heard from him. Well, and they have a picture of me too in the orphanage. But by that time, my parents had found me and taken me out of the orphanage.
Wow, what a story. You have any idea what happened? Have you ever know what happened to that couple, the one that had tried to adopt you? Yeah.
No.
I have a couple questions that have come in here. This was obviously very traumatic, your experiences, especially as a child. How did you adjust after liberation?
This is all conjecture. I can't say for certain. And I've often wondered, how did the Holocaust affect me? And I don't know. I did meet a psychologist one time that told me that it had an impact on everyone, no matter how young you were. I've wondered what I would have been like had I not experienced the Holocaust. And I don't know, because to the best of my knowledge, no clone of me exists that didn't experience the Holocaust. So how my life would have been and what has remained with me, I don't know. I do have certain characteristics that I think might be due to my early experiences. So for instance, I have a great need to have an adequate supply of whatever I need. Long before I run out of a certain item of food, I try to get a resupply. I have a very great need not to be enclosed. I couldn't live on an island. It would drive me nuts. So whether I use a road to leave New Brunswick or not doesn't matter, but the road exists, and to me that's, if I drive in the wintertime, I look at the ditches in case I have to get into a ditch. Does all that, would I have those characteristics if I hadn't experienced the Holocaust? I don't know. I think that maybe they're sort of exaggerated in me because of my early experiences.
For sure. And there's really, as you said, there's no way to know, because it's your experiences, it's what you know. Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned New Brunswick, which obviously is your home and has been for many years. A question has come in about what's the experience been for you sharing your testimony and memories in New Brunswick, which may not have the largest sort of Jewish community. What's your experience been like when you've worked with schools or communities in New Brunswick or in the Maritimes?
Well, actually, my experiences have been the same, whether it's been in New Brunswick or I've spoken in Nova Scotia and PEI, Newfoundland, in Quebec and Ontario, in various places in the US, and in Poland, in Germany, as at the request of the Canadian Embassy in Germany on a couple of occasions, and in Switzerland at the request of the Canadian Embassy. And I only mention that because the experiences are uniform. They're no different in Berlin than they are in Nashwauk, Sis, New Brunswick. The questions are pretty much the same, and they don't vary as to whether you're what the audience is, the age of the audience. Like I spoke once at the law school at UNB. The questions are the same. And very interestingly, I spoke in several places in Berlin, and the questions are really much the same as the questions that you get anywhere else. And they're always uniformly respectful. But let me share with you, I don't know how the time is working.
We're good. You got time. You have time.
The very first time I spoke was in a middle school in Armagh, New Brunswick. And I just went about my life. I didn't talk to people about the Holocaust. but I was asked to speak. So, I was a professor and people want to know, then how could I say no? So I went to this school and all the kids came in and it was in their auditorium or in their gym, and they all sat on the floor and I was up on the stage and I gave my talk, and then we had questions. And one question I don't think I've had it elsewhere, but I did have it from a girl that I think was about 12 years old, and it told me a lot about her. And she said, how did they know who was a Jew? And I answered, I wasn't, it was the first time I talked. There were no questions that I particularly anticipated. But that question told me a lot about that little girl and about her family. I think she looked at me and she said, you don't look any different than my grandfather. So how did they know who was a Jew? And I also thought that girl had not been taught to hate. I can tell you the answer that I gave. First of all, the Nazis made the Jews identify themselves. You either wore a yellow star or you would be punished for it and you could be shot for it. So they didn't know they were going to kill all the Jews, so people self-identified. Second of all, your neighbors knew who was a Jew. In the same way that little girl knew who her neighbors were, who were Catholic, who were Francophones, who were Anglophones, the neighbors knew. And unfortunately, in many instances, the neighbors told the Gestapo who their neighbors were, whether they were Jewish or not. And of course, there was another way. And I've always felt that I had to answer every question in exactly the same way, whether it was an adult or a child, whether I was speaking in a church or not, whether it was in Germany or in the US. And I told her that in Poland at the time, all male Jews were circumcised and the Gentiles were not. And frequently, the Germans used that as a sign. And if there was some unfortunate non-Jew who was circumcised, they'd be shot too.
Quite an answer, for sure, absolutely. Interesting question that actually came in that I'm curious about, because you've mentioned that the types of questions that you get are very similar no matter where you are, and we've seen that as well. Someone here wants to know, what's the most common question that you normally get asked?
What did we eat in the shelter, in the attic?
And can you answer that one for us?
Well, initially, it's usually about the first question. Initially, my father had contracted with a young Gentile to bring us food. And that lasted for a short while. And he would come once a week because obviously you didn't want to be seen, you didn't want to be caught. But then he didn't come one week. And the adults said, oh, well, it must have been a dangerous situation. He'll come next week. But he never came again. And we found out after the war that he had been taking Jews from Poland to Hungary. Jews were persecuted in Hungary, but they weren't being killed at that time. So, people tried to save themselves in any way they could. And so some Jews engaged this man to take them to Hungary. They got caught in the border and they were all shot. The flour mill, my father was a co-owner of the flour mill, and he knew it very well. And he would crawl out of he would go out and he'd go to where they milled the flour. and he would bring back some flour. And not only that, but for some reason, there was also barley. Why there is barley in a flour mill, I have no idea, but there was barley. And he'd bring back barley and flour, and we mixed the flour with water, and we had a kind of a hot plate that we baked that on. It was, I suppose, similar to what you would call pita today. And we boiled the barley in water, and that was it. That's what we ate for 2 years. And my mother told my wife that if we hadn't been liberated by the Soviets, she didn't think that I would have lived another 2 weeks, because I had refused to eat anymore. You know, when we had the barley and water, the soup, I would stick my spoon into the bowl and see how far up the soup went. Then I'd eat a spoonful or two, and I'd stick it down again and see what level it was at now.
And how old were you about when you were in the attic?
I was from 5 to 7 in the attic.
Wow, those experiences, especially as a child, you know, that young, having to be quiet and to be trapped with people, with other families. You know, I really want to thank you so much for being part of this program today, and for sharing your stories, and for answering all of our questions. I speak on behalf of everybody here again that was listening. Thank you so much, Israel, for being part of this, for sharing your story, for allowing us to be witnesses. Elie Wiesel did say it right. You know, every single person on this call now, they become those witnesses. They become the people that carry the story forward. And again, on behalf of FSWC and the Raoul Wallenberg Centre, it's been an absolute honor to listen to you tonight. I want to thank you so much for everything. And I want to thank everybody else on the call tonight as well for joining us. We hope you'll tune in again 2 weeks from today on October 27th for our next installment. You'll get information from me about it. Any questions that you have, please feel free to reach out anytime. That goes for everybody. And I want to thank everyone. Have a wonderful evening for tonight.
I'm glad I was able to do it.
I'm so glad you were as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Bye.